the frontbench spokespeople who have resigned their positions are closer to your position, clearly, than they are to the Labour leaders. Can you just talk us through precisely what the difference is between calling for humanitarian pauses to be extended upon a road towards a ceasefire and calling for a humanitarian ceasefire?
Well, the first thing, I appreciate how wide your listenership is. I recognise there are people listening to this who will have family members, loved ones who've been killed by Hamas on October the 7th or taken hostage. And I also recognise some of your listeners will have family members, friends or loved ones who've been killed by the Israeli military over the last 5 to 6 weeks, more than 11,000, including more than 4,000 children. I also recognise, by the way, the massive increase in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, which we've got to condemn unequivocally. I think it's possible, James, to, with good faith, disagree on an issue in relation to what should happen in the Middle East. I think it's wrong to subscribe to those who are against a ceasefire a view that they are in favour of or they're condoning the killing of civilians. Similarly, I think it's unfair and wrong to subscribe to those of us calling for a ceasefire that we're somehow Hamas supporters or we are naive. I'm quite clear in relation to the reason why I call for a ceasefire. I think the bloodshed's got to stop. I look at the 120 countries who are supporting a ceasefire, the United Nations supporting a ceasefire, the UN General Secretary calling for a ceasefire, all these humanitarian organisations calling for a ceasefire. But also, I know from my time in government, the difference a British Prime Minister calling for a ceasefire can make. In 2009, Gordon Brown, our Prime Minister, and the opposition called for a ceasefire. And a few days later, Israel, in fact, unilaterally did have a ceasefire, and the Arab League persuaded Hamas to have a ceasefire, which was first for a day, then weeks, then months, then years. The bloodshed has to stop.
I suppose my question looks more at the notion of postponement, and in fact your example of 2009 rather proves the point, because you're both you and Keir Starmer are calling for a postponement of combat. And yet your side of the argument pretends that you're calling for a cessation when you know it will start again. And Israel would argue, and supporters of Israel would argue, that the best way of ensuring that it doesn't start again, or the best way of prolonging the postponement for as long as is possible, is to continue the bombardment.
Well, history tells us continued violence doesn't lead to peace. What we need is, of course, a roadmap to a two-state solution. We've got to get the respective parties speaking, but we've got to get there in the first instance by stopping the killing. I'm afraid there's lots of bad faith now in that part of the world, even worse than there was in the past. But just pause and think in our lifetime, James, we're of a similar age. Just look, I'm not giving equivalence, by the way, to these parts of the world, but it's just a comparison. Just look now at Lebanon or Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland and South Africa. At some stage, calm heads recognised the importance of a cessation of violence. Use the word pause. That led ultimately to a permanent ending of violence. But unless you call for a ceasefire, how are you going to get there?
Do you think Keir Starmer's handled this quite well or quite badly?
Well, on a whole host of issues to the Middle East, I agree with Keir in relation to the importance of advocating for a two-state solution, the importance of food getting into the Gaza Strip, medical supplies, water, humanitarian aid. On this one particular issue, we've just got to, disagree in an agreeable fashion.
But do you think he's handled the disagreement well? I mean, from a leader point of view, even though you would rather he agreed with you, has he handled the dissent well?
Well, I think his response to, the vote yesterday was the right one in relation to recognising the differences. He also used the word regret for those colleagues that couldn't vote in the way he wanted to do so. And I think Keir's shown over the last few weeks that he can accommodate differences within the Labour tent.
We'll hit the phones imminently, but Johnny's just reminded me of something that I asked everyone to remind me of, so Johnny goes straight to the top of the class. What happened to that thing about getting Oyster cards, the kids' Oyster cards onto their phones? You forgot about it, didn't you?
I've not forgotten about it. I've not got the answer now. I haven't because
it was months ago. I forgot about it.
It came from the brains in the O'Brien family. That's why I know it's a good idea. And
exactly.
So I'll come back to you shortly.
Not good enough, Mayor Khan. Not good enough. Thank you, Johnny. Feet to the fire next time you're here. Right,
Johnny, a.k.a. James's daughter.
It's not. It's here. It says Johnny. Shall we go to the phone?
The first caller, good morning, is from Ealing in West London, and it's Finlay. Hi, Finlay.
Good morning, James and Sadiq. How are you doing?
Not bad.
Good, mate. Thanks.
My question is as follows. The Conservative candidate for Mayor, Susan Hall, liked tweets praising Enoch Powell's racist quotes, as well as some containing Islamophobic abuse. Language matters, particularly at a time when community tensions are so high. Do you think it's acceptable for politicians to promote offensive and divisive views such as this?
That's a bit of a gimme, that, isn't it? And also a slightly rhetorical question. So briefly, if you would.
Well, Philly, I think there's the short point and there's a bigger point. The short point is, of course, I think somebody who likes Powell and supports Trump doesn't deserve to be the mayor of London. But there's a bigger point, and it goes to something we've seen last weekend and the week before that I spoke about publicly, which is, I think, one of the jobs of politicians, whether you're the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister, the Mayor of London, or a would-be Mayor of London, is not to play in people's affairs, but to address them at these times in particular, to bring people together and to unite communities. And I think what you've illustrated in the examples you've given, and there are many others in relation to the Tory candidate aspiring to be the Mayor of London, is in a diverse city like London, where you and I both know there can be times of the year, the times of a 4-year cycle, which there can be passions running high. You've got to be bringing people together rather than dividing communities. And I think that's why it's incredibly important. We know the history of the last 2 mayoral elections. I'm hoping this one will be different. Let's wait and see. But I think, she's shown she's not fit to be the mayor of this great city.
I'm no surprises there. I would add that her defence of the tweets to which Finlay refers was that she didn't remember doing them and that she didn't intend to cause offence with a string of tweets that included amplifying a well-known far-right provocateur who was abusing you and apparently liking a sort of encomium to Enoch Powell. Let's crack on. Thank you, Finlay.
Thanks, Finlay. The next caller is from North London, Islington, and it's Abdi. Good morning, Abdi.
Good morning. Good morning, James. Good morning, Mayor Khan.
Good morning.
Witnessing the conflict in the Middle East has been horrifying, especially the disproportionate response by Israel. First of all, I'd like to commend you, and you deserve full credit for being one of the first UK leaders to call for a ceasefire. My question, however, and concern is around the rising community tensions here in London. How are you making sure that the conflict in the Middle East isn't played out in the streets and schools of our great city?
Abdi, thanks for your question, and thanks for the way you asked it as well. Look, Abdi, you and I, and all the listeners here who aren't Jewish, need to understand there are Jewish Londoners who are scared. We've got to recognise that. Every Jewish person I've spoken to, met with, engaged with, is affected by what happened on October the 7th and subsequently. And by the way, we've also got to recognise there are many Muslims across our city and country who are scared. We've seen a massive increase in anti-Semitism and an increase in Islamophobia as well. And what I've sought to do, Abdi, not just over the last 5-6 weeks, but during my mayoralty, is to work with London's diverse communities, particularly young Londoners, to give them the skills, the tools, the resilience, so they don't look for things that are different straight away, but look for things that we have in common. Also dealing with some of the stereotypes that exist, the tropes that exist about Jewish people and Muslim people as well. Tensions are running high, Abdi. There has been this massive increase I talk about. And one of the things I want listeners to do is just to be cognizant about how their behaviour is received by the other. So, for example, yes, strictly speaking, a particular chant may not be a criminal offence. Yes, strictly speaking, your behaviour may not be a criminal offence. But how it's received is petrifying to the recipient. And so it's really important that we recognise that one of the joys of living in London is our diversity. But we should be sensitive to how others are feeling. And I mentioned in answer to James's question at the top of the show, Abdi, I've met Londoners whose family, friends or loved ones were killed on October the 7th. I've met Londoners whose family, friends and loved ones have been killed by the Israeli military. And so it is tough, Abdi. I think we're going to get through this. The last thing I'll say, Abdi, is this. I think we should be able to disagree agreeably, even on really emotive, passionate issues like this. And I worry some of the things people are saying and doing may make it really difficult once the tensions have ended for us to carry on being good neighbours and good friends and good colleagues.
How worried were you on Saturday about serious violence? How worried were the Met?
So incredibly worried. So you'll remember, because it was played out in the media, what the Home Secretary said. And I was concerned that some of the language she was using would encourage, embolden the far right to turn up on Saturday to, inverted commas, protect the cenotaph. No risk, by the way, of the organisers and the pro-Palestinians going anywhere near the cenotaph because they'd agreed with the Met Police Service to stay well aware. I was in regular contact with the Commissioner and his top team during the Friday, Saturday and Sunday. You know, James, 18 officers were injured, 3 of them hospitalised, 3 hospitalised, and it was thuggery from the far right. Their leader comes along after promoting himself on social media, incites his followers, then jumps back in a cab and drives off. Typical cowardice leadership from far-right leaders. But we were worried. But also, James, during the course of that day, I'm not sure if your listeners realise, a lot of the members of the far-right then sought to go to where the pro-Palestinian march was taking place to cause violence there as well. And so there were incidents on Saturday of hatred being spread, both Semitic hatred, but also Islamophobic hatred. That's why Abdi's question is so important, because we can't allow this small number of people inciting hatred to divide our communities. And I'm afraid, the Home Secretary that was, emboldened and encouraged that sort of behaviour.
Are you saying that you believe that the Home Secretary effectively summoned the far-right thugs?
Well, there was no talk before the intervention of the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister of Remembrance Day, the Remembrance Sunday or Armistice Day being affected. None of the organisers of the pro-Palestinian march, there were a number of organisers, a number of groups, had agreed with the Met Police Service to stay well away from the cenotaph, well away from Parliament Square, because they were aware, Armistice Day. And so it was never an issue in relation to jeopardising Armistice Day or Remembrance
Rishi
Sunday.
very much created the idea that it was.
Exactly right. And that then what happens then is, social media amplifies these things. Park for a second the deep fake stuff in relation to, my intervention and my involvement in relation to this.
Just tell people what you're talking about, because not everyone will be aware of that.
So it was brought to our attention that there was stuff circulating on social media amplified by the far right, where I'm allegedly, I can say it's me, where I am saying to a group of people that I'm telling the Commissioner what to do and so forth and so forth. And that led to, obviously, a lot of anger. Those
it was completely manufactured. It was completely fake
yeah.
footage, but it looked quite convincing.
Yeah.
That's quite scary, isn't it, moving forward?
Well, the serious point in relation to the future is that the technology now with artificial intelligence and the speed with which these algorithms work is, you can imagine during the course of a close general election or the hours before a quite emotive march, how you can incite hatred and sow division and mislead people. This disinformation is really serious.
Final question about this. I read reports the police felt that the attacks upon them had been caused by the comments of the former Home Secretary. Is that something you'd agree with? Well,
I think police officers and former police officers have spoken publicly about this over the weekend, and you're echoing what they've said. That's how they feel. That's how they feel. There are a number of joys of our democracy, James. We talk, when we talk later on, about separation of powers, the executive, the legislature and the judiciary. There's also one of the joys of our democracy, the executive. People like me, the Home Secretary, can't tell the police what to do, all right? Because just imagine where it would end. They could today tell the police what protests to allow. Tomorrow they tell the police who to investigate. The day after who to charge. And that's why it's incredibly important to keep them separate. And there is a concern that some of the language used by the Home Secretary and, by the way, Prime Minister, gave the impression that the police were being political. They were, inverted commas, choosing sides. And if you're on the other side, you can understand why there might be animus towards the police. And the police have to police without fear or favour. We can't ask the police their views on Remain or Brexit or, the Middle East or COVID rules. Their job is not to ask, those sorts of questions, but to implement and enforce the law.
Another call, please. Thank you, Abdi.
Thanks, Abdi. Thanks for your question. The next caller is from Brentford. Richard. Good morning, Richard.
Oh, good morning, Mayor, and good morning, James. Can I say I'm really grateful for the calm way you're dealing with this, because whenever I hear people commenting on this, that emotions get really high, and I'm really trying to understand what's behind the call for the ceasefire, because I put 2 questions to you, I think. We're not dealing with rational people on one side, are we? We're not dealing with people who are afraid of dying. They're not. It's not like 2 equal parties willing to submit themselves to logic and reason. They could have freed the hostages. No hostages, as well, not very many, have been released so far. They could have done that, despite the onslaught. And they are committed, aren't they, Hamas, to ridding the world of Israelis. So when I think people use the term naive, it's pejorative, it sounds rude, but I think what they're trying to say to people on the other side of the debate is it's a hope. We all want to stop the bloodshed. We'd all love it to stop. But saying have a ceasefire, it will change nothing. What will change Hamas and what will stop future bloodshed if there is a ceasefire? Give me those arguments, and then I'll begin to see the other side, I think.
It's a great question.
Well, Richard, thank you very much for the great question, but the way you've asked it, and I'm hoping that you and I can demonstrate over the course of the next few minutes how we can disagree agreeably and be respectful with each other. So look, let me deal with your core points. I think you're spot on. Hamas is a terrorist organisation. Israel is a state. So we've got to be a bit careful in relation to equivalence. But the consequences of the actions of the Israeli military and of Hamas are similar in the sense of the bloodshed and the killing. So it is a fact that more than 1,200 innocent Israelis were killed by Hamas, a terrorist atrocity. It is also a fact that more than 200 Israelis have been taken hostage by Hamas and yet are yet to be released, and they must be released. It is similarly a fact that the Israeli military is responsible for the deaths of more than 11,000 Palestinians. The vast, vast majority, I'm sure we both agree, innocent, men, women, more than 4,000 children. Now, what we can do is say we support what Israel wants to do in relation to self-defense, but actually the concept of self-defense is one that's got to be proportionate. The best analogy is if you throw a punch at me, I can't shoot you with a machine gun. The response has got to be proportionate when it comes to self-defense. International law says that, as well as domestic law as well. So, of course, Israel's got a right to defend herself. There should be a targeted action to get those hostages released. But unless there's you can call it a cessation of violence, you can call it a ceasefire. Unless there's a call for that, how can you ever get that? And I use the example deliberately, Richard, when it came to James and I's intervention before in 2009. And the reason why 2009 is relevant is not just did Gordon Brown call for a ceasefire, and by the way, so did the Shadow Foreign Secretary, William Hague. Gordon Brown then worked his socks off to get that ceasefire, first going to the United Nations. The US government weren't pleased, they abstained on the vote, and then persuading the Israeli Prime Minister, who, by the way, Richard, had a unilateral ceasefire, which led to Hamas also having a ceasefire because the Arab League got involved. But here's the point, Richard. How can you have an objective where you want to kill off Hamas when the way you're conducting yourself is leading to a conveyor belt of new people wanting to join an organisation? Call it Hamas, call it something else, where the ideology is to fight thy neighbour who is Israeli. And that's what we've got to address. We've got to stop the conveyor belt of people being radicalised to hate Israel. And by the way, can I say this, Richard? It's really important I say this as the Mayor of London. I think it's offensive to assume every Jewish person endorses completely the policies of Netanyahu, just like it's offensive to assume, by the way, you're not doing this anyway, I'm just saying, opportunity for me to say this, that every Muslim person endorses the policies of Hamas. And I think it's really important for us to be able to talk like this and explain the pros and cons of a cessation of violence, a ceasefire. But Richard, unless you call for something, there's no chance in hell of it happening. And the best way for us to be a dear ally of Israel, to be a friend of Israel, to say, listen, what you're doing is not leading to people supporting your cause and your struggle, but it's driving the public opinion away.
So what you're saying essentially is that and everyone could agree that the goal would be a complete end of attacks in either direction, and you're saying, I think, that can't be achieved by attacks. That can only be achieved by negotiation, by talk. And what Richard is saying, and there's always plenty of evidence to support this position, is that Hamas are quite explicit about their commitment to the destruction of Israel. So there is grave doubt surrounding the notion that from that perspective, proper peace is ever achievable.
Sure. Well, Richard, here's the point. So let's not assume that Hamas will always be the representatives of the Palestinian people. We know in the West Bank, it's Fatah. And so that's the first point. But secondly, are you more likely or less likely to get people withdrawing from Hamas and supporting Fatah if you're seeing a disproportionate use of force in the Gaza Strip. And so I think we do need to show allyship to Israel. Of course we do. We've also got to be saying to Israel, listen, your end game, the destruction of Hamas, is that possible when they could reinvent themselves with a different name, with the same ideology? And that's why, at some stage, there's got to be some, talking and a resolution. And if the Prime Minister of the UK, he's crossing his arms saying, well, we can't do anything because the US hasn't asked for this, that means, frankly speaking, we've not got an autonomous foreign policy. We've not got our own foreign policy. We'll do whatever the US president does. Gordon Brown, 2009, is an example where we showed we've got an independent foreign policy and we took leadership.